Good. So good afternoon. It's good to be with you all. I'll just be talking a little bit about some of the ways that the NAACP and our partners talk about the issues around vulnerabilities and assets as we think about sea level rise and extreme weather. And then I'll also talk about some of the ways that we are addressing, well, some of the ways that the communities of color and low-income communities are particularly impacted, and then also the ways that we're addressing some of these issues briefly. And so first of all, as a civil and human rights organization, we look at this through a civil and human rights lens. So we look at the ways that sea level rise, extreme weather are violating our various human and civil rights. So everything from the right to safe and healthy working conditions, the right to the highest standards of physical and mental health, and other rights as it relates to kind of political, economic, and education, healthcare, et cetera. And you'll see as we talk how all these are disproportionately impacting certain communities. And we also talk about not only how people are impacted and how they're vulnerable, but also how and what their assets are, but we also talk about how even the systems that are designed to address some of these issues are also flawed in some ways because of them not necessarily being rooted in the realities of the frontline communities that are impacted. And so we really talk about equity as it relates to procedural equity, distributive equity, and contextual equity, meaning like how decisions are made, who's making decisions, what the power distribution is in decision making, how resources are allocated, and so forth. So we look at all of these issues as we think about the designing systems for dealing with sea level rise and disaster through an equity lens. And so as we actually put together a tool called Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation. And it was based on our work particularly with disasters, but also around sea level rise and other issues like shifts in agricultural yields that result from extreme weather. And we started to put together some of the ways that communities can be both vulnerable as well as have assets, and how we need to be looking at this in advance of disasters, or certainly in advance of sea level rise and the potential displacement that people will face. So these are some of the factors that we've looked at: demographics, housing security, food security, mobility, health status and systems, environmental hazards, emergency services. And these are some of the examples of the actual indicators that we look at in this sense. So I'm just going quickly through these, and I'll talk more in kind of real talk about some of the examples. Some of the other examples include economic factors, businesses, jobs, public and private utilities, social services, governance, policies, who's involved in decision making, the extent to which there's community cohesion, what the community knowledge is in terms of preparing, the community engagement, and then also cultural. So we'll see cultural impacts play out as we talk more about some of these impacts. And then the examples of some of the actual indicators that we look at, voter registration, participation, incidents of voter suppression, because these are all, as we'll see later on, these all directly relate to how we actually design systems and who's making decisions about how systems are being designed to make communities more resilient. And so then we look on the other side after incidents have occurred, disasters and otherwise, like what are the outcomes? Like when we put together these systems, who still has their life afterwards? Who's been injured? Who still has their physical or mental health? What is the status in terms of safety and well-being after we put these systems in place? What has been the impact on community and culture? Who still has their land? Who still has their home? Who's been displaced temporarily? Who's been displaced permanently? So these are some of the things that we look at, as we evaluate systems on the back end, particularly around disasters. And then, just some of the examples of those. So speaking specifically, as we look at sea level rise, as some of you may know, the Maldives actually has a seawall built around it, and to hold back because they're so vulnerable to sea level rise. And in 2009, they actually had a cabinet meeting underwater to illustrate both internally and to the world that this is where they're going to be. At that point, in 20 years, now it's 15 years. And so they literally are talking to Papua New Guinea, Solomon's Islands, and so forth to negotiate for being able to move their entire populace to another nation, another landmass. And they're not alone. Right here in the United States, whether it's Kivalina Island in Alaska and Thibodaux, Louisiana, sorry about the resolution there, these are both places that within 15 years, whole communities have to move due to sea level rise. rise. Thibodaux is actually complicated by, they're losing a football field worth of land per hour due to the combination of sea level rise and the fact that the land is sinking because of the excessive offshore oil drilling that happens there, them being in the petrochemical corridor. So in the United States, in NOAA talks about, this is one of the more chilling things that I've heard since I've been doing this work, is an official from NOAA saying that today's flood equals tomorrow's high tide. I mean, the fact that now people are having 50-year floods every couple of years, you know, South Carolina with their 1,000-year flood, the extent to which we're having coastal vulnerability is just increasing to such a, I know Ben talked about that, Ben and Amir talked about that earlier. And then we talk about, you know, the water supply sustainability, and this also starts to combine with other issues, places like Detroit, which has had all these water shutoffs, Baltimore, which had 23,000 people under threat of having their water shut off. So we have this kind of growing scarceness of water combined with privatization of water, and what that means in terms of water is what we see as being a basic human right. Like the notion of actually being, today my hotel shut off the water at 12 o'clock, so don't anyone get near me. But there was so just like, even just for that, you know, that amount of time, that 12 to 4 no water situation was just a tiny glimpse, and I of course have other resources and so forth, but the notion of that you can just cut off water to an entire family is just unbelievable, and you're seeing more and more of this. And what this means also in terms of the shifting agricultural yield. This is a picture of land that used to be fertile. They used to grow crops and so forth, and now it looks like that. And what that means for certain communities that are already food insecure. They actually, a lot of communities, now the food justice movement is saying they don't want to use the term food desert anymore because A, food desert makes it seem like it's something that naturally occurs, and that B, it makes it seem like it's something that's just kind of permanent and not changeable. And A, in terms of the natural occurring piece of people see that, you know, whether it's redlining or modern day development discrimination that happens, that a lot of this kind of apartheid in terms of resources is actually intentional to some extent, and definitely disproportionately impacts certain communities. And so when we see some communities that are only getting their food out of a place like this versus communities that have either a supermarket or a farmer's market, and what that looks like, there are people who are getting food that's high in sodium, sugars, preservatives, just all bad stuff, basically, nothing. So either stuff is actually is actually damaging to your health, or at the very least not protective for your health, like the foods that are high in antioxidants and other vitamins and nutritions and nutrients and so forth. And so, and these, unfortunately, again, are low-income communities and communities of color who are facing this disparity in terms of what they have access to, and that's only getting worse as we have these shifts in agricultural yields. And then we talk about extreme weather in other ways. You know, the more so we see extreme weather as even, you know, in terms of impacting drought and so forth, and then these more kind of violent extreme weather and the types of impacts we have and the vulnerabilities as it relates to poor housing stock. As it relates to being next to toxic facilities. As you may or may not know, as doing work around environment, we're finding that low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to live next to toxic facilities, whether it's coal-fired power plants, nuclear reactors, incinerators, all these basically toxic facilities. African-American family making, and it's not just income, but it's also race separate from income. An African-American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. But even so, across all race, across all racial groups, if you have a lower income, you're more likely to live next to a toxic facility as well. And so when you see that, as we saw with Fukushima Daiichi, the combination of an extreme event, whether it's flooding or earthquake, and that potentially impacting a toxic facility like that, then brings communities more likely to be harmed. I mean, people can't even live near where the Fukushima Daiichi situation happened, even now, years after the event has occurred. And now, recently, I actually went to South Carolina after the flooding, and they have all these coal ash ponds. And when all that flooding happens, like then the coal ash is full of selenium, all these different kind of heavy metals and toxic metals, and that's just kind of washing down the street, washing into people's homes as the floodwaters go forward. Not to mention any other kind of toxic things that come from these types of facilities. So we see that intersection as being a key one. the other pre-existing vulnerabilities, including mobility, people's ability to escape quickly when these disasters happen, what kind of infrastructure there is, what kind of use of existing resources or lack of use of existing resources, who are the ones who end up in these dire rescue situations versus people who have better access to information and better ability to get out early. People who's living in floodplains. This is in Tunica, Mississippi, after the flooding of 2011, where this whole swath of community, they had these developers that come through and sold these homes to this community the year before. And the year later, they were just inundated by this water because they'd all purchased these homes, low-income African Americans, in a floodplain because they were reasonably priced homes. And so now we have a number of communities that are most vulnerable and that's why they buy their homes in the floodplains, but yet they're the ones who are now being impacted by these 50-year floods, 100-year floods that are happening regularly now. And then we see after the Superstorm Sandy, you heard about people who were trapped in the upper levels of these high rises as the electricity went out. People who were mobility challenged couldn't get back downstairs, or the water was such that people couldn't come downstairs. So the vulnerability that lies in being in a public housing or high-rise housing like this. And then again with the mobility, lots of people weren't able to, 1,800 people died, and many of whom because they weren't able to evacuate the city after Hurricane Katrina. And then, not only because of lack of vehicles, but also differential health or ability to move and so forth. And then we talk about prisons as well in terms of vulnerability. In Hurricane Katrina, the deputies actually abandoned their posts, left people just locked up for days after Hurricane Katrina. And as the kind of sewage tainted waters were rising, people weren't able to get enough ventilation, had to dig through the walls just to get enough ventilation to be able to breathe, as they were just literally abandoned. And then that same prison labor is actually used in the cleanup after disasters. I don't know if you heard the wildfires in California, they actually utilize prison labor, and that you don't know the extent to which that's voluntary and what kind of protections folks got. Certainly after the BP oil drilling disaster, people didn't get the same amount of protective gear as other communities got. And so what does that mean in terms of as we look at post-disaster context? And then we talk about who is able to respond, who's most impacted. This I took as a picture in Huntsville, Alabama, after the the tornadoes and flooding a couple of years ago, where it was struck at that moment when I was in the food line that literally every last person in the line who was receiving food was African American, and every last person who was giving out the food was white. And this was like a line that was like 30 people long at that point when I was standing there. And that just really struck me in terms of who was able to bounce back, who was able to respond, who wasn't necessarily impacted in the first place, and what that actually means. And then outside, similarly, when I was looking up on the stage at the town hall meeting where they were giving out information and resources and so forth, there were the people on stage who were primarily men and primarily white. There was 2 women up there. And these are the people from local government, FEMA, the Red Cross, and so forth. And then lined up at the mic at that moment, all African American, all women who needed the information, who needed the resources, and so forth. And again, that just struck me in terms of both the race and the gender pieces there. And then in the after disaster context, this was one of the landfills I went to visit after one of these disasters where a lot of the toxic materials went and so forth. And then this was actually with the BP oil spill, but it's kind of, disasters are disasters and whatever happens with them. And this is just a schematic that Color Lines put together that talked about how landfills are disproportionately, again, in communities of color. So when these disasters happen, when these toxic wastes get put into landfills, which are notoriously underregulated, they end up being disproportionately in communities of color. So, and this is just kind of the percentages, the POC is people of color. So the largest amount of waste went to a community that was 76% people of color and so forth and so on. So just to give you a sense. And then we talk about after disasters, who's able to return, like, what does it look like in Joplin, Missouri in terms of the people being able to go back versus Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or any other place, and what we know of Hurricane Katrina 10 years later in terms of people still being kind of this Katrina diaspora all over the country because they weren't able to return home. And who's able to, this is a family that wasn't able to come back and wasn't able to, they had actually just built their home 8 months before this tornado came through. And it was like their dream home they had saved up for their entire lives. They were retiring there. The tornado came through. They were hunkered down on that tile there. It was like the father, the grandmother, the grandson and then the father were all just huddled, watching their roof come off as this tornado came through. And then we talk about the kind of change that we need, the type of reforms that we need to be able to better prepare people. And there's even impediments to the types of systems change that we need. When we talk about in the post-Katrina Louisiana situation, there was all this levee redevelopment that happened where all these levees were being reinforced. But when Hurricane Isaac came through in 2012, we found Plaquemines Parish completely inundated again. Plaquemines Parish is largely like poor oystermen and fisher folks and so forth. And it was, the levee had no work done at all. And so when Senator Mary Landrieu was questioned as to why this was, she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question. And they said that they use a formula to decide which levees they're going to reinforce first. And the formula is based on economic impact only. So again, if you've got a high-rise, multi-billion-dollar high-rise versus 500 shacks, even though it's the 500 shacks that really need the protection more, the multi-billion-dollar high-rise is going to be the thing that gets the protection in that kind of equation. So we really need to be thinking about what equity means as we try to build resilient communities and resilient infrastructure. And we all know that this is all tied to politics. Who's making decisions, what's driving the different decisions around how we're responding to climate change is very politically motivated. And so we have people who are investing in kind of this denial around the fact that climate change is even happening, much less that there's anything that we need to be doing about it right now. And so this is a video I was going to show, but I think we don't have enough time, so I'm going to just breeze by. But I definitely recommend, especially you as journalists, you might appreciate it. It's the climate name change. It's actually kind of a parody of news reporting, but the idea is to actually name hurricanes after politicians that deny climate change. So if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. If you Google climate name change at 350.org, you can find it online. Maybe if we have time in the end, I'll show it. But so we talk about another way. We talk about the fact that we need to get involved we need to be more civically engaged, because the types of decisions that lead to the levees being reinforced based on economics alone, the types of decisions that lead to the types of situations where only certain people are able to bounce back and other people are more likely to die, more likely to be injured, more likely to be permanently displaced. Those are the types of decisions we need to be thinking about more closely, particularly as communities that are more impacted. And we see this all tied to a voting rights agenda as well, and we see this tied to a democracy agenda because, for obvious reasons. We also see a linkage between, this is actually two women who are affected by Super Typhoon Haiyan. And this is a woman from Gulfport, Mississippi, who's actually going to be here speaking tomorrow, Kathy Eglin. And so they were all together really uniting around their common experience around these disasters. We also are doing a lot around community planning to really make sure that the solutions are driven by communities. And this is kind of just basically more of the same, so I'm going to wrap up because my time is pretty much up. But we use this kind of as our foundational principle. It takes strong roots to weather the storm. Community leadership is imperative to address the root cause of the climate crisis and foster resilience. There's a few more slides after that, but I'll wrap up because my 15 minutes are up. Thank you very much.